Hey guys, what's up? When movies incorporate fantasy elements in their stories and plot lines, does that make the movie fantasy? A non-fantasy movie that has fantasy elements in it, does that make the movie fantasy, or is it a different genre? Is it the other genre that the movie also is from? If you look at the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze, right, that old movie. If you haven't seen movie Ghost, great movie, check it out. I highly recommend it. It's about this Patrick Swayze. Basically, he gets killed. He becomes a ghost, and he doesn't move on, to the next world. He just stays in the world that he's in, and he tries to interact with the other people who are living and who is around him, and realizes his friend was the one that got him killed, and it's a whole story. What's interesting about that story is it's mainly, it's a lot of different elements in that story to put it together. And so the whole relationship between him and his wife is a love story. There's a relationship between his wife and his friend. After he dies, she starts dating his friend, and it's sort of like a romance story there also, right? You could say that the fact that he's a ghost could make it sort of not a horror story because it's not really scary, but because it's a ghost, you could put it under thriller or horror. You could put it into that genre because, even though it's not a scary movie, horror movies are usually like scary movies. This one has horror movie elements. A ghost is a horror element, but it's also a fantasy element, right? You've got a lot of other stories which have ghosts, and they're fantasy elements. Like if a wizard summons a ghost, right? Or if you look at the movie Ghostbusters, right? Okay, so what is it really? It's a comedy, but it's also a fantasy. Is it a horror? It's got horror elements in it, right? It's got monsters. It's got all of the different monsters in the movie. So it's funny. It's got monsters, which makes it horror. It's got ghosts in it, a lot of ghosts. And there are a couple of scary, sort of thriller kind of scenes in the movie. When they're in that library and then the ghost is just hanging out reading a book. And they walk up to the ghost and start to talk to him, and the thing turns around and yells at them, and they run away. That's a little bit it kind of scares you a little bit. It kind of brings you back a little bit. If you look at something like the scarier movies, like Friday the 13th, or the movie where they fall asleep and then Freddy comes over and and kills them in their dreams and stuff like that. Those movies, there's a lot of fantasy in those movies, but how much of it is it really horror? If you look at Gremlins or something like that, right? It's a horror movie, it's not scary though, and it's got fantasy elements. Thing about fantasy, what's interesting is that fantasy used to be basically mainly medieval fantasy. So mainly the movies that came out in the 70s, 80s, 90s were fantasy. So if you look at something like The Matrix, which came out in the 90s, right? That is largely a fantasy movie. Is it science fiction? Yes, because there's technology and there's it's the future. And so because anything that's technological or happens in the future is science fiction, right? But it comes to the point where they can't really scientifically explain the whole world of the Matrix. They try to explain it. They're like, oh, it's this world. You plug into the machine and you're there. But they don't actually explain how it's done because they don't know how it's done because it's impossible to do it technologically, But the thing is, because they don't really explain what it is and all the powers that you get when you're in the Matrix and how going into the Matrix, you can actually defeat the Matrix. Or defeat the Agent Smiths that are in that Matrix that are coming after the people that are in that ship. It makes it like a fantasy movie because it's not necessarily all scientific. So if you look at something like Star Wars, there's fantasy because of the Force. That's magic because they deal with magic as well. But if you look at the rest of Star Wars, it's all sci-fi, which means everything is all of the machines, all of the instruments, the blasters, the lightsabers, they're all technological instruments. Basically, it's only besides the Force, which is the only fantasy element in Star Wars, the rest of it is just all sci-fi elements or story elements where things could be real if the things in that movie were real, you know. But if you look at a lot of movies, like recently, that come out a lot, like in recent times, you'll notice a lot of urban fantasy, which is like fantasy that is happening at the time, fantasy that's happening like during the present day. And they didn't have that. They didn't have a lot of that happening in the 80s and whatever. There weren't any movies like that. All 80s movies were like Conan the Barbarian, Clash of the Titans, Crow, tons of movies that came out in the 80s that were basically all medieval. And if there wasn't medieval, it wasn't necessarily fantasy. It was some other genre. But recently there's been this urban fantasy uprising, basically, you know. There's just been regular stories that just have a lot of fantasy elements in it. If you look at a movie like American Werewolf in London, right? Is it scary? Is it a horror movie? I wouldn't call it a horror movie. I would call it a thriller comedy, because there's a lot of funny stuff in that movie, and it's humorous and it's lighthearted. But at the same time, there are werewolves, and they are scared. They're walking through the forest and they're scared, and they're hearing these howls, these animal noises, you know, predator animal noises coming from all directions. They're like, what the hell? And they start running, you know, away from this werewolf thing. The werewolf actually attacks them and rips one of the guys up, and that guy comes back because he can't like go on to the next world. He stays in limbo, and he walks around like as a sort of like dead body, just walking around, and visits his friend and tells his friend that he's a werewolf and he has to kill himself, because if he doesn't, he'll turn into a werewolf and start eating people and killing people. And him and the people that were basically killed by him cannot move on to the next world. They have to stay in limbo as undead, you know, walking the present world and stuff like that. And then there's like these dreams that he's having, and he doesn't know if the dreams are real until he wakes up. And there's like dreams within dreams where he wakes up, but he's still in a dream and he doesn't know it. He thinks he's awake, and then he wakes up again because then he's really awake. You know, those dreams within dreams thing. And so it's not a thriller. It's not like a gory thriller, scary movie. You know, it's not Halloween, right? It's not Friday the 13th, which is just a scary movie, you know, or any of those scary movies, because they basically, their horror, their idea of what's scary or what's a thriller, what their movie's about, there's a lot of gore, you know. And even though, I mean, there are funny parts in Friday the 13th movies. I mean, a lot of them are funny because the kids are like, basically they go to this, you know, like abandoned shack or something in the middle of nowhere in Crystal Lake, and they just start living there, and it's like the whole interaction between all the kids and whatever, they're funny. There's also love stories there. I mean, there's like kids, you know, kind of hooking up with each other and stuff like that. Not really kids, they're pretty much, they're like college level, you know, people, whatever, but you know, they're hooking up with each other and shacking up with each other, and it's sort of like, it's not like a overly romantic love story, but it is kind of romantic. You know, there's some romance in it, and you know, and so, but it's mainly horror, and that's because there's very, very little fantasy in it. There's some fantasy, but mostly it's horror. Like the fact that Jason, which is the monster in the movie, in Friday the 13th, the killer was Jason. He wears a hockey mask. You probably saw it. It's a popular movie. But what he does is he basically lives under this lake. You know, he comes out of the lake and like grabs someone and pulls them into the lake or something like that. And that, it's not necessarily horror. It cannot be explained by anything besides fantasy element, that he's able to breathe underwater, which is a fantasy element. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't see that movie as being a fantasy movie. Not the same thing like Excalibur is a fantasy movie, or Lord of the Rings is a fantasy movie. You know, you don't see that movie as being fantasy because basically it's a scary movie. There's screams and there's like gore, you know, it's violence, there's people like, you know, there's like killers chasing people and stuff like that. And you see that as a horror movie because it's a little bit scary, it's a little bit like gory, could be disturbing at times and whatever it is, you know. But what's interesting, what they do now is they take movies and they create a whole bunch of different genres that just put it all together. So if you look at recent movies like Stranger Things, right? A recent, pretty good, really, really good. It's season 3, season 4 is going to come out. It's on Netflix. A lot of people have seen it. It's really good. If you haven't seen like Stranger Things, check it out. It's a really, really good series. But what's interesting about it, it's got a monster, which is a horror element. However, the monster is from another dimension, which is a fantasy element. Also, the kids play Dungeons and Dragons, which is a fantasy game, right? And also, it's in the 80s. So what is that? I mean, that's sort of like an 80s look back, kind of an 80s, like reliving the 80s kind of thing. You know, so if you lived through the 80s, you kind of relate with that. If you never lived through the 80s, you kind of see how the 80s were and how cool they were, you know? Just like, you know, anyone making movies about hippies, right? It's like, it's about the 60s and people that not everyone lived around the 60s, you know, not everyone's a boomer and lived in the 60s. So if you lived in the 60s, you kind of remember how everything was. If you didn't live in the 60s, well, now you know what the 60s were about, you know? So there's that element. Are there, like, is it a romance movie? There's a little bit of a romance. The woman who's the mother of the kid falls in love with the cop who's like the sheriff of the town, and they've got a little thing going on, and it's not like serious and whatever it is, but there's something happening there. There's a little bit of romance. There's some people hooking up with each other and stuff like that. There's that kind of romance. And what they're doing, like, they're taking horror elements. They're taking romance elements. They're taking fantasy elements. They're taking all of these different science fiction elements where, like, this monster is from another dimension, but also they're using a technological tool in order to open the door to that dimension where that monster is coming from. So there's like science fiction elements in it also. And what they're doing more and more is putting fantasy elements into movies that are not necessarily in any other way fantasy. You know, it's not medieval, it's not in the past, it's not like wizards or anything like that, but there is magic. There is creatures that the only way that you can explain them is through magic. You know, they don't really explain what the monster in Stranger Things, how he you know, lives. They don't understand it. You know, it's from another dimension, which is like, you could say that's sci-fi, you could say that's fantasy, right? And so what they're doing now is they're taking fantasy out of the medieval and putting it into the everyday. They're putting it into the urban fantasy. They're putting it into how people, you know, kind of like, you know, a story that otherwise wouldn't be fantasy and make it fantasy. So thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you liked the video. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in another video later.